Good evening, comrades. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We're taking a look at Norman Finkelstein's seminal book, The Holocaust Industry, which was first published in the year 2000, but it is very pertinent. And unfortunately, we couldn't get Comrade Finkelstein himself. He's spoken in a number of sessions that we were involved in the past, but he is understandably extremely busy at the moment. He's running his own channel and has got meetings coming out of his ears. So, but we have the second best possible speaker on this issue, which is our own Ian Spencer, who's reread the book and secondary literature around it. So thank you very much, Ian, for preparing that. It is a hugely important book, isn't it? It's still very much up to date for today's situation.
It is, and it's been updated by Norman Finkelstein as well. And of course, if you want to hear him in person, he's also widely available on YouTube. His lectures to the Communist University and a number of other fora are all available on YouTube as well. So if you want to follow up listening to Norman Finkelstein himself, that's available there. I've also added a couple of other little things that I think are of importance about the development of Norman Finkelstein's thesis. Well, so without further ado, it was interesting today on Al Jazeera to see coverage of South Africa's case against Israel, accusing Israel of genocide against the Palestinian people, particularly in Gaza, but also, of course, on the West Bank as well. As part of that, before there was a recording of an Israeli spokesman. I didn't write his whole name down. I just remember it was Gilad someone. And his denunciation of South Africa, apart from denouncing it as anti-Semitism. Apart from that, he made direct reference to the Holocaust and the fact that how dare South Africa bring this charge against Israel, which had been instrumental in establishing the legal basis on which something is regarded as genocide in the first place. And of course, South Africa has been vehement in its support for the Palestinian people since the end of the apartheid regime. And of course, Israel stands accused not merely of genocide, but also, of course, of apartheid and of ethnic cleansing. And with that in mind, it's well worth reading Norman Finkelstein's book, The Holocaust Industry, Reflections on the Exploitation of Jewish Suffering. It's a fascinating book for all sorts of reasons, and it's very readable, a very enjoyable read, insofar as anything like that can be enjoyable. But it's very well written. It's in many respects a book of two halves. The first part is a consideration of the way in which the Holocaust has been appropriated as a means of the continuing justification of the actions of the State of Israel against the Palestinian people. And the other part is the way in which, again, the Holocaust has been used to extort money effectively from Germany, Switzerland, but not necessarily in the interests of Holocaust survivors. And I'll come more onto that later. But largely in the interests of promulgating Zionism as the only possible solution for the Jewish population of the world, in support of the State of Israel. This is Norman Finkelstein, if no one knows him. Born in New York City in 1953. Both his parents were from Poland and survived the Warsaw Ghetto. His mother, after the Warsaw Ghetto was suppressed, was sent to Majdanek concentration camp, and his father to Auschwitz. His father was in receipt of a pension from the German government for the rest of his life for ill health and injuries sustained as a slave worker in Auschwitz. It's interesting to reflect on Finkelstein's political background, as it were. If you read the book, you don't really get a sense of this is somebody who's writing from a Marxist perspective. He's writing largely from the perspective of being a historian who specializes, if anything, in taking apart the methodology of other historians, other writers. It's an interesting observation he makes about the existence of writings about the Holocaust in general, and with a few exceptions, he describes most of them using the excellent Yiddish word schlock, which is slag, clinker, dross. But his political background, whilst it has obviously driven his studies forward, doesn't come across in a tendentious way in his work. Although, having said that, he is by nature polemical. So his parents were both supporters in a qualified way of the USSR. They were grateful to the USSR for having defeated fascism, and in a sense also supported the fact that the USSR gave recognition to Israel on its foundation, but was subsequently extremely critical of the state of Israel, and particularly the way in which it treated the Palestinian people. Neither of his parents ever once considered emigrating to Israel. Finkelstein himself, really radicalized by the Vietnam War, became a Maoist, and he worked part-time as a social worker in New York whilst he was undertaking his academic studies, and eventually gaining, as it were, a tenure track appointment at an American university, but was eventually denied tenure in no small part because of his book, The Holocaust Industry. Norman Finkelstein taught English in Palestine at Hebron and Bet Sahar. He was a guest of Palestinian families who he lived with, and never once, he says, never once regarded it even remotely important that the fact that he was Jewish. There was no animosity to him as a visiting Jewish teacher of the English language. His education here, so he did his first degree at Brickhampton University in 1974, and he did his PhD at Princeton University on Zionism, and in particular, the way in which Zionism had influenced historiography. His original kind of specialism was in aspects of French politics, but he's subsequently focused largely on the Holocaust. In 1982, he was his first kind of action in supporting the Palestinian resistance, as it were, was protesting against the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And in 2000, he published The Holocaust Industry. It has subsequently been revised with additional chapters, particularly on the way in which money was extracted from the Swiss banks. And as a direct consequence of his work, The Holocaust Industry was refused tenure by DePaul University and was banned from entering Israel in 2008. In fact, he was detained at the airport and then deported on the basis of his work. He's written a number of other works, including Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom. He has himself been academically supported by Noam Chomsky, who he read. Well, after he broke with Maoism, he regards himself as what he calls an old-fashioned communist or an old-fashioned Marxist. And he was supported in his work by Noam Chomsky and Raul Hilberg, who I'll come on to in a moment, and Avi Shlayam. Avi Shlayam is, of course, fascinating because he was an Arab Jew born in Baghdad to a relatively wealthy family. And it's an interesting feature that Avi Shlayam talks about as well. His books are fascinating because his experience, of course, was that with the creation of the State of Israel, Jews who had lived throughout the Middle East for centuries now found themselves being attacked. From that point of view, the existence of State of Israel has done a lot to exacerbate anti-Semitism rather than provide a refuge for it. So this little cartoon, I couldn't resist putting in. Norman says, if Hamas blows up a bus as it used to do in Tel Aviv, and then says, we intended to destroy the vehicle, not the passengers, people would laugh. But how different is it if Israel had dropped a 1-ton bomb on a densely populated neighborhood in Gaza, as it did in July 2002, and then said, oh, we didn't intend to kill the civilians, we just intended to kill a Palestinian terrorist. And of course, that's exactly what we see happening in Gaza at the moment. Whole areas being laid waste to. 1% of the entire population of Gaza has already been killed, and almost all of its population rendered homeless. The book then, the first part of the book makes an interesting point. We tend to think of study of the Nazi Holocaust as being around for some time. What Norman Finkelstein points out is that before 1961, there was really very little interest whatsoever. He grew up in a Jewish neighborhood. His parents were not religious Jews. He was not religious, but nevertheless, he grew up in religious communities, in Jewish communities. But there was very little interest taken in the Holocaust, particularly before 1961. And then when looking at the reasons why, there are a number of factors he identifies. Firstly, that now Germany was the most important ally that NATO and the USA in particular had in the Cold War. Germany, of course, having been divided. And what was important here was the Cold War and not any dragging up anything about the Holocaust. Any kind of mention of the Holocaust was something as seen as being a left-wing preoccupation. He points out that left-wing Jewish activists talked about the Holocaust. Almost nobody in what he regards as the Jewish establishment in the USA regarded as important. Now, one of the criticisms often leveled at Norman Finkelstein is that he effectively says things which, coming from somebody who was not Jewish, might be regarded as anti-Semitic, namely the idea of there being a Jewish establishment which has power in the context of the United States and beyond. The point he's making really is that the Jewish population in the United States is not completely homogenous, and where you have a population which is established, assimilating and attaining some kind of political influence, this group of people did not want at all to be associated with the left-wing radicalism, which was a feature of many Jewish communities in the period immediately before and after the Second World War. Remember that before the Second World War, the amount of interest in Zionism was regarded as, it was a very small proportion of the total number of Jewish people who were politically active. And more importantly, they were regarded as really kind of odd. If Jewish proletarians were involved in anything, they would be involved in socialist or communist politics, or they would be, or in the Jewish Workers' Bund. They certainly weren't even remotely interested in emigrating to Palestine. If they wanted to emigrate to anywhere, it would have been the United States. But of course, the coming into power of the Nazis changed a lot of that. And of course, as we know, the Nazis themselves were far more tolerant of Zionist organizations than they were of socialist ones, whether with Jews, whether they had a Jewish membership or not. So the Nazis would have been extremely hostile to the Bund, but much more lenient with regard to Zionist organizations. And so the other point about this, of course, is that in the period after the Second World War, in the 1950s, the 1960s, there was a almost febrile atmosphere of anti-communism. And we kind of think of the McCarthyite period in which, and it's a very interesting study of how McCarthyism was tied up with an implicit anti-Semitism, in the sense of associating Jews with radicalism, Jews with a divided loyalty. Again, a common theme in looking at anti-Semitic approaches to Jewish populations. So the Jews were associated with the left, and the last thing that the kind of more prosperous, assimilated Jews wanted to be concerned with associated with, was the left. So you didn't really see any kind of mention of the Holocaust, and really until the 1967 war. 1956, of course, was the Suez Crisis. And in a sense, the first example of where Israel played a role in furthering a wider imperialist interest within the region. So 1956, Israel attacks Egypt, and on the basis of that, Britain and France intervene to seize control of the Suez Canal in an effort to protect the imperialist interests of both Britain and France, but also, of course, it was Britain and French shareholders who owned the Suez Canal, and Nasser's attempt to nationalize it threatened those business interests. Later on, there'll be a whole series, there'll be a whole session on, if you like, secular Arab nationalism and the role in particular of Nasser. So in the meantime, so with 1956 with the Suez Crisis, the American president wasn't prepared to support Israel completely, and Israel, Britain, and France were forced into a humiliating climb down. The argument is that Eisenhower was interested in not just the establishment of a Jewish state in Israel, but he was also balancing that against the interests of oil-producing countries in the region. His interests were in making sure they retained good relations with Jordan, with Egypt, and with Syria. At the time, there was a real fear that the Israeli incursion into Egypt might damage US relations with regard to these oil-producing countries. So what we see in Finkelstein's book is he documents the way in which the Holocaust industry became important only after Israel had become an important part of US foreign policy in the Middle East, US foreign policy which saw the protection of the Suez Canal and of oil interests in the region. And that the Holocaust has ever since been used to justify the actions of the state of Israel. So reading Ilan Pappé's book, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, it was interesting to read that even in 1947, 1948, Ben-Gurion was using the idea that this was going to be another Holocaust to wipe out the Jews as the justification for the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and the killing of tens of thousands of Palestinians in the first Nakba. Finkelstein goes on really to argue that the total numbers of survivors of the Holocaust has been inflated. He argues that if you look at reputable historians of the Holocaust, the numbers of people who actually survived the ghettos and the camps was about 100,000 in 1945. And certainly by the time he had written his book, he was suggesting that there couldn't have been more than about a quarter of those still surviving. And one of the reasons for the numbers of survivors being inflated was the need to extort money effectively from the banks in Switzerland and the German government. Whilst at the same time ignoring this very similar culpability that existed in US banks. So the argument is, for example, that many people who had suffered in the Holocaust had lodged money in banks that they couldn't then subsequently get at. And the same is true in the United States, but that has been conveniently ignored. I just want to mention Raul Hilberg, because Norman Finkelstein mentions Raul Hilberg as the most reliable, the most scholarly authority on the Holocaust. His book is expensive if you buy the 3 volumes. The one I looked at was about 265 quid on Amazon. I did contemplate getting it. You can actually read a 1-volume version online. If you go to Raul Hilberg's entry into Wikipedia, in the reference section, there is a link which takes you through, and you can read it's about 400 pages, the single volume, and that's, I think, largely based on his doctoral thesis. So Raul Hilberg was born in Vienna in a Polish-speaking Jewish family and fled Austria in 1939. His father had been arrested in 1938 when the Nazis invaded Austria. Because his father had been a distinguished First World War veteran, he was released, and that gave them enough time to get out, and eventually they settled in New York. Raul Hilberg served in the US Army from 1944 to 1946, before going on to do his master's degree and then PhD at Columbia University. And his doctoral thesis, The Destruction of the European Jews, he had the greatest difficulty of getting it published. And I brought in Raul Hilberg here because, firstly, because Norman Finkelstein refers to him, and Raul Hilberg has also been very, very supportive of Norman Finkelstein's approach. Raul Hilberg dedicated his entire life to investigating the destruction of the European Jews, as it were, from a German perspective. He was interested in looking through the documents, how ordinary civil servants were participating in the destruction of European Jewry. He had the greatest difficulty of getting this work published for all sorts of reasons, principally because, on the one hand, he didn't really fit very well with the idea of trying to portray Jewish resistance. Hilberg, for example, argues that the amount of resistance there was by Jews against the destruction was really very limited. Moreover, he awkwardly talks about the Judenrat and the fact that in the ghettos, for example, Jewish policemen were engaged in collusion effectively with the Nazis in their operations. Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Library and Museum in Israel, and Hannah Arendt both opposed the publication of Paul Hilberg's work. And he wasn't able really to obtain a good publisher until he eventually expanded his doctoral thesis to what he wanted it to be in the first place, 3 volumes, and published in 1985. He later taught at the University of Vermont, and interestingly was awarded Germany's Order of Merit. Now, the reason why I mention Hilberg is partly because of the relationship with Norman Finkelstein, but also because of the way in which any kind of attempt to depart from a standardized way of portraying the Holocaust, it leads to academic suicide, effectively. Just as Finkelstein was denied tenure at DePaul University, Raul Hilberg found the greatest difficulty getting his work published. And what I also found interesting was in looking at this, Raul Hilberg's supervisor was one Franz Neumann. Some people may be familiar with the book Behemoth, the structure and practice of National Socialism, I've got a rather lovely Left Book Club edition published by Victor Gollancz in 1942. So Franz Neumann was Raul Hilberg's PhD supervisor. Sadly, he was killed before the PhD was finished, so it was finished off by someone else. But Franz Neumann was born into a Jewish family in what is now Katowice, which was part then of German Silesia. Neumann was a member of the SPD, supported the German Revolution in 1918, and in 1933 escaped to England and studied under Harold Lasky at the London School of Economics, where he published his book, Wehrmacht, The Structure and Practice of National Socialism in 1942. Later, he moved to the US and worked for the Office of Strategic Services. So really, he was providing intelligence information for the American government on the nature of German fascism, and also he wrote some stuff on the nature of the Soviet Union as well. But interestingly, he also spied for the USSR. But it's not clear that he was actually providing very much other than intelligence material of this nature. So, it wasn't like he was passing military secrets. Not that I particularly mind if he did. So in the US, he was later working for the Frankfurt School of Social Research, as it was, in exile in New York before being killed in a car crash. His book is well worth reading. Wehrmacht, it's really rather like a lot of the Frankfurt School stuff, Western Marxism, so-called. It's kind of a Marxism blended with Weberian sociology. So it's an interesting kind of empirical account. The interesting thing about Wehrmacht really is that whereas there's a tendency to see National Socialism, Nazism, as being something with a kind of guiding thesis outlined in Hitler's Mein Kampf, and the intention was to destroy the Jews from the outset. Franz Neumann's Wehrmacht dissects National Socialism as, in a sense, almost a kind of something which operates on the basis of expediency. There wasn't any original intention to liquidate the Jewish population of Europe. National Socialism responded to situations as and when. And the original intention, of course, was, as we now know, first of all, that the Jewish population of Germany should emigrate and leave their property behind, and then later was ghettoized, and only later was exterminated. But I mentioned Franz Neumann simply because he supervised Raul Hilberg's PhD, and Raul Hilberg's thesis was highly influential on Norman Finkelstein. So given the importance of Israel to US foreign policy, it's worth thinking a little bit about it. So here's a nice picture of Menachem Begin and Ronald Reagan. Menachem Begin was, of course, leader of the Irgun, whilst Ben-Gurion was responsible for the Haganah, the sort of main Zionist militia that carried out the original Nakba in 1947, 1948, displacing hundreds of thousands of Palestinian families and killing tens of thousands of Palestinians to seize the land for Jewish settlers. The USA recognized Israel in 1947 and the USSR shortly afterwards. As I mentioned, the Suez Crisis of 1956 was put the US president in a difficult position. But by the 1967 war, Israel had come to be seen as a vital ally in the region, particularly with the possibility that the kinds of Arab nationalists like Nasser, who could potentially threaten the supply of oil to the USA and the West in general, it was seen as important as to have Israel on side, and in particularly in the context of the 1967 war, where the success of the Israeli Defense Force was so overwhelming, it was seen as effectively having a muscular agent on the side of Western capitalist countries in a region which was potentially going to be influenced by Soviet foreign policy. Of course, the fact that the Soviet Union had supported not only the establishment of Israel, but supplied arms to the Haganah and the Irgun, and indeed, it's questionable as to whether Israel would have survived without Soviet help. It's not clear why Stalin was supporting Israel, except possibly to hedge his bets, as it were, in the hope that Israel would become an anti-Western force, an anti-capitalist force. Certainly, by the time of the 1967 war, certainly by the time of the 1956 Suez Crisis, relations between the USSR and Egypt were well established. And there was a concern with the influence in the Middle East of the USSR. The other point about it that Norman Finkelstein makes is that with the victory of Israel in the 1967 war, all of a sudden, to support Israel was not only a sign of was no longer associated with the left, as it were, because Israel was now a central feature of US foreign policy in the Middle East. Support for Israel became an important part of being Jewish in the United States. And whilst, of course, there remained a Jewish left, a progressive force within US politics. So, we think of the civil rights movement and the important part played by Jewish activists in that. Nevertheless, as far as what Norman Finkelstein talks about as the Jewish establishment, support now for Israel became almost a patriotic requirement of being a US citizen. And so instead of the idea of there being this dual loyalty, firstly to Israel and Judaism, and also then to the United States, now they were united as one. To support Israel was to support the United States. And so from that point on, really, you start to see a mushrooming of the Holocaust industry and the growth of an enormous amount of what Finkelstein calls schlock in terms of Holocaust, the production of books about the Holocaust, films about the Holocaust, and so on, because it all played into an important sub-theme around the support for US foreign policy. And of course, even before the current war, Israel was regularly receiving something in the region of $3.8 billion a year in military aid. And that's quite apart from all the other assistance in terms of, for example, the United States underpinning Israel's access to loans and so on. So the role, the interrelationship between Israel and the United States in this context is absolutely crucial, and crucial, therefore, to the development of the Holocaust industry. And the Holocaust industry providing this constant justification for whatever Israel does as a victim of the Holocaust, it is therefore entitled to prevent that from ever happening again. And the same thing is being portrayed. In 1967, an argument was that here it is again, the Arabs trying to carry out yet another Holocaust. Two-thirds of Norman Finkelstein's book is really about what he calls the shakedown of Germany and Switzerland in terms of the extraction of vast amounts of money, supposedly in reparations to Holocaust survivors. But in fact, most of the money seems to have been appropriated either by the State of Israel directly or through, for example, Holocaust memorial organizations or lawyers or people associated one way or another with the Holocaust industry. And the amount that actually got to those remaining Holocaust survivors was very little and paid very slowly. So Germany had offered to pay reparations as early as 1952. As I said, Norman Finkelstein's father was in receipt of a pension from the German government. And what Finkelstein argues is the two central dogmas of the Holocaust industry is that first of all, that the Holocaust is a unique event in history, and secondly, that it was the climax really of an irrational hatred of Gentiles by Jews, of Jews by Gentiles. The idea is, in some sense, that this irrational hatred of Jews by Gentiles is something which is, as it were, immutable and therefore justifies the existence of the state of Israel. As I tried to argue in my session on the Jewish question, Karl Marx and the Jewish question, and what is anti-Semitism, where we looked at the work of Abraham Leon, is that anti-Semitism has a history. It hasn't always been an eternal feature of the relationships between Gentiles and Jews. At various points in history, Jews and Gentiles and Arabs, Muslims have coexisted for centuries. And it is a particular context at a particular time where we see anti-Semitism, where you have the decline of feudalism and the growth of capitalism. And similarly, and the reason why I mention Wehrmacht and Franz Neumann is because, again, anti-Semitism in the context of Germany and German National Socialism it is understood in a particular way. It's understood as a way of the importance of crushing any kind of possible opposition to capitalism in general, and in the context of a National Socialist Germany, the Nazis were seen as agents to prevent the possibility of another attempted communist revolution. And Franz Neumann understood it in those terms. Leon Trotsky, incidentally, understood it in those terms. So rather than it being a question of an irrational hatred of Jews by Gentiles, it is something which takes place in a historical context. But the Holocaust industry, it portrays it as this deep-seated, irrational hatred. The picture, by the way, is a plaque in Willy Brandt Square in Warsaw, which commemorates Willy Brandt's act of supplication in 1970, when at the wall commemorating the crushing of the Warsaw Uprising, Willy Brandt knelt in supplication. So Germany has effectively paid billions of dollars in compensation, largely to prevent the possibility of the boycott of German goods and to foster trading relations with Israel. And actually, Germany is now one of the most important trading partners that Israel has. And similarly, in Switzerland, one of the reasons why Norman Finkelstein attracted quite a lot of criticism from the left is that, in a sense, he was seen as kind of, why would you want to defend the Swiss banks? The nature of what he calls the shakedown of the Swiss banks was not dissimilar to that of Germany. There were millions of marks deposited in Swiss banks by Jewish victims of the Holocaust, who subsequently couldn't get their money back out again. What you're going to do, if you've got some money, you really want to put it in the bank of a neutral country, don't you? Of course, Switzerland had a lamentable history in terms of refusing to accept Jewish refugees. Except I think there were about 20,000 managed to escape to Switzerland. The overwhelming majority of Jews who escaped the Nazis went eastwards into the former Soviet Union. Others, if they could get out soon enough, went to the United States or wherever else. And Switzerland was not exactly forthcoming about accepting Jewish refugees. But effectively, Norman Finkelstein argues that the Swiss banks were paid out billions of dollars in compensation, largely under pressure of boycott and the World Jewish Council lawsuit against the Swiss banks. The point about this is, of course, not that compensation shouldn't have been paid, but the compensation didn't go to the survivors. The compensation went into the pockets of lawyers, into the Israeli state itself, into organizations whose principal job it was to continue the whole business around the Holocaust industry and of arguing that the Holocaust continues to be the justification not only for the existence of the state of Israel, but as a justification for anything that Israel chooses to do in terms of promulgating its interests up to and including the genocide of the Palestinians. Thank you.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you very much, comrade. That was a really good introduction, and it is worthwhile reading that book. I think it really explains and puts into context not just the Holocaust industry, but explaining how Israel has been, the picture of Israel, the picture of what happened has changed throughout history and has been instrumentalized. The first person who wanted to come in is Tony Greenstein. So I'm going to make you a panelist. If you have questions, comrade, please click raise hand and I can bring you in as panelists. You can ask a question or you can make a comment. There were a few questions in the chat. Comrades, I can't follow that all because I'm also doing all the technical stuff. So please do come in if you have a question, though I do try to read some out in the Q&A if you want. And another interesting book, just quickly before Tony comes in, is Norman Finkelstein's A Nation on Trial, where he takes apart Goldhagen's theses that basically all the Germans were to blame, that there's anti-Semitism is integral into the Germans, and so the whole nation was to blame. There's no difference between, communists or social democrats, Jew, and those who perpetrate all these crimes. Anyway, Tony has to go very soon, so I'm bringing him in first, and then I'll bring in other comrades. Hi, Tony.
Yeah, hi, Tina. I'm sorry that I've got to go, but I've got an Al Jazeera interview as well, so I'll try and make this as short as possible. I think it's an interesting and it's a path-breaking book in many ways. However, I would not say that it was a brilliant book. It's very scrappy and it's very bitty in many ways. And I also think that Norman Finkelstein got too distracted by the kind of reparations, the money shakedown, and so on and so forth. And what he didn't really concentrate on, indeed, he dismissed the whole question of the utilization of memory, which he described as an ideological construct. In his book. I mean, he's right. It is an ideological construct, but it's a construct for a particular purpose, which today is the justification for whatever Israel does. I mean, he pointed out, you mentioned Raul Hilberg, who was unsurpassed in terms of being a historian of the Holocaust, but of course, the version of Holocaust history that Hilberg dealt with was not the one that was useful to Israel in its weaponization of the memory of the Holocaust, which is incidentally, of course, what my book concentrates on. It's how the Holocaust is used, I think, which is important today. I mean, Zionism starts from the basis that Hitler's extermination of the Jews, which of course happened in 1941, not at the onset of the Hitler regime in 1933, was a war against the Jews. I mean, that's the title of a book by Lucy Davidovitz and Yehuda Bar, who's the chief Zionist historian, adopts that completely. And that there is pretty much a unanimity that the Nazis were not about destroying the labor movement or about being anti-modern or anything else. Their sole mission was a demonic hatred of the Jews, and therefore that was their sole concern. So the fact that Dachau, for instance, was opened as a concentration camp for socialists, communists, and trade unionists, and completely passes them by, as does the extermination, for example, of the Roma and other people who are disabled, for example. So Zionism has constructed a particular historiography, and someone like Hilberg, who, as I say, even Yehuda Bar had to describe him as unsurpassed, did not fit in. I mean, he dismissed Jewish resistance as being of little consequence, and I think he was right. He was also criticised for the fact that he used German documents as the basis of his primary research. Well, of course, since the Nazis spoke German, I'm not quite sure what other language they would expect them to have dealt with, certainly not Hebrew. So there was all that. I mean, in essence, the Nazis' anti-Semitism stemmed from the fact that they saw Jews as the biological parents of Bolshevism, which was their main target. And Hitler, whenever he refers to Marx, always calls him Marx the Jew, and he talks about Judeo-Bolshevism in his in Mein Kampf. But I come back really to my point that, and this is about Norman Finkelstein, I think he concentrates and misses the point in many ways. The great thing was not the question of the reparations. Yes, I mean, the reparations went to all sorts of Zionist educational foundations. It disappeared into the pockets of lawyers. There was a massive scandal in America, the Jewish Claims Conference, which took a large part of the reparations, and there was just open embezzlement and so on. Whereas in Israel itself, over 1/3 of the Holocaust survivors to this day live in poverty. So I mean, the Holocaust was never about those who survived. It was never about the individuals who died. It was always about how Zionism could best use it. Firstly, when Hitler came to power, his ascent to power was almost welcomed by the Zionist leadership. And in the wake of the Holocaust, the Zionists have exploited it. But it was after 1961 that the Holocaust became a major, if you like, ideological weapon in Israel as a result of the Eichmann trial. And the Eichmann trial itself was a consequence of the Kastner trial, where a major Jewish collaborator had launched a libel suit against his detractor, who had called him a collaborator, only to find that the evidence was against him. I don't have time to go into it, but Finkelstein also missed out. I mean, he talked about the shakedown and the reparations. In fact, one of the major thieves of Jewish property in the war was actually Israeli banks, who sequestered hundreds of millions of pounds. And there's still a campaign in Israel by the survivors for them to release it. So clearly it wasn't really about the justice of what had happened, but really about Israeli rearmament or Israeli armament. And their deal with Germany was incredibly important. Germany, in essence, provided the submarines, the nuclear technology, and much else besides. And the payoff, of course, was Israel did not raise any objections to the integration of West Germany into the NATO Atlantic Alliance. So I think it's a useful book, of course, but I think it's very, very anecdotal, and the end doesn't get on top of its subject. An equally important, possibly more important book is the book from which he takes a lot of his inspiration, Peter Novik's Holocaust in American Life, which describes in detail how the Holocaust figured, if you like, in the life of American Jews, and how it was ignored throughout the post-war period, as you said, because of anti-communism. And then the further away the Holocaust was, the greater significance it had. Also, I think Finkelstein concentrates or over-concentrates on the Holocaust in terms of the American Jewish establishment, and doesn't deal really with the way Israel itself has utilized that. And I think that's extremely clear today when Israel is characterizing its attack on Gaza as a war against the Nazis, no less. I mean, there's no point in deconstructing that. It's pretty obvious who the Nazis are. It isn't the Palestinians. So I'll really leave it at that. And if I can re-enter this discussion, I will later on, depending.
Excellent. Thanks, Tony. You should maybe convince Norman to do a third edition with all the changes. Yeah.
Well, yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Anyway.
See you.
Bye.
Thank you. Ian, there's a couple of questions I want to put to you before I bring in some people from the floor. In the Q&A, for example, I'm not sure you know that, but do you know how many copies have been sold of this? I've just tried to look it up briefly, but I couldn't find it.
I don't, but it's been very widely distributed and translated into a wide range of different languages, including German, and has sold very well. I'm not disagreeing with Tony at all. I think, you know, Norman Finkelstein's book is about the way in which the Holocaust has been used by Zionists. It isn't really it isn't as detailed in other areas, but nevertheless, I mean, I remember as a student trying to think myself about the way in which the Holocaust was being used at the time, and actually it took Norman Finkelstein's book to kind of crystallize that. As somebody who's not Jewish and being constantly accused of being anti-Semitic, it was played I think a powerful role, and it's on that basis really that it has sold in very, very large numbers, but the precise figures I couldn't say.
Yeah, no, I think Tony might be right about some of these things, but it is, as you say, it is a very easy read, as well as being quite political and explaining very well how it has changed for various reasons. And also, which gets to the second question, which is I mean, it is, you know, Tony criticized it as the personal, it's a bit too about his, you know, being an American Jew, etc. But I think he really explains really well the experience of Jews who survived the Holocaust. Not only was it not talked about, it was seen as an embarrassment. You know, he says they kept it quiet. His parents were embarrassed because it was seen as you did something wrong. You were led to the slaughter. You know, you should be ashamed for having survived that, because, you know, it meant that, you know, you didn't fight back, and, you know, you were, so it was seen as being embarrassment. It was kept quiet, etc. Jews were wanting to make it in America and not being, you know, being identified with that horrific experience, and just sort of move on and do it all, and, you know, conquer the world, etc. So I think it's really interesting to explain from that aspect how that then all of America as well got behind Israel, and for what reasons. So I think he does explain that experience quite well. And there's a related question from Carol. Is it true that the Jews that died in the Holocaust were at first thought of an embarrassment by the Zionists as well, because they didn't resist as they should have? So in Israel as well, was there a similar aspect, not to try and, you know, talk about the Holocaust too much?
From what I've read, yes, and that somehow they went like lambs to the slaughter, as it were, and because they didn't fight back, it was seen as somehow shameful. Of course, it ignores the very real heroism of, for example, the Warsaw Ghetto, the very real heroism. I mean, it was a rather chintzy sort of film, Defiance, with Daniel Craig, about the Bielski Otriad, you know, partisans. And what it ignores, of course, is that millions of Jews actually fled eastwards and joined the Red Army and joined partisan groups and the rest of it. So in a sense, Raul Hilberg maybe understates Jewish resistance somewhat, and maybe Norman Finkelstein does a little bit as well. Having said that, I think it's right that there was a kind of embarrassment about the way in which it was. I think the other thing that Raul Hilberg got into trouble for was the extent to which the Jewish police and the Judenrat colluded, and of course some of these organizations were dominated by Zionists, and opportunities to get people out were often missed for that very reason, that it was in the hands of Zionists.
There was a question: why did Hannah Arendt in particular? Why did she oppose Hilberg's publication? For those reasons, or were there additional reasons?
I think it was largely for that, the fact that he was portraying the Jewish population as somehow passive, that he understated the extent of resistance. Yeah, I think largely for those kinds of reasons.
It was interesting as well when you were talking about the the changing nature of the Holocaust and how it was seen, how it was being used, first ignored and then used, is also reflected quite well, I think, in that famous Pastor Niemöller quote, which I did an article about a little while back and researched it as well, because that has changed quite dramatically over the decades. Because initially, I mean, in his original, he actually starts off with, first they came for the communists and the trade unionists and the socialists. All of that got lost in when it's being retold, and when you hear it today, everybody knows it's first they came for the Jews, or sometimes you get first they came for the trade unionists, etc. But clearly, that has also undergone a weaponization and a changing in the popular memory, etc. Okay, a question then as well on the you mentioned the uniqueness, which is of course used. This Jewish suffering during the Holocaust was unique, or is presented as unique. There's nothing like it before. There will never be anything like it since, as a reason to not criticize Israel. I mean, that is very, very much sort of what's happening today still, isn't it? I mean, that's been going on for some time, and it's now sort of means you cannot not allowed to compare to the millions killed in the slave trade, Ireland closer to home, Palestine now obviously is the obvious one, that is all. It's not allowable to compare the two. So the uniqueness is a huge importance of the Holocaust and how it's presented. How does Finkelstein, or how does the research, how do you view that importance of the uniqueness of the Holocaust?
I mean, it manifestly isn't unique, is it? I mean, it's estimated that 10 million were killed in the Belgian Congo whilst the Belgian Congo was wasn't even a colony of Belgium. It was the personal property of King Leopold of the Belgians, and 10 million Africans were killed in the course for the extraction of rubber, for example. And I think the question around uniqueness as well, what's often lost is the fact that the Nazis associated Judaism or Jewish people with radicalism, rather than Jewishness as such. As you've already said, in 1933, it's the communists and the social democrats and the trade unionists that are hauled off first, many of whom would have been Jewish, but that's incidental. They were being got rid of because they were communists and social democrats and trade unionists. So, in terms of uniqueness, well, I think we also need to remember that millions of others have been slaughtered for political and economic reasons as well. But the idea that somehow creating any kind of equivalence between the genocide of Armenians or whatever else is regarded as something which I don't see how that on earth that threatens Israel. you know, quite clearly there is nothing unique about it.
Yeah. It's an interesting point, isn't it? Yeah, sorry.
The methods are extraordinary.
Well, it was an interesting point that Finkelstein makes, is that it's presented like the Jewish suffering was so unique. That means that we need to use different methods to discuss the morality when it comes to, for example, the occupation of Gaza and the occupation of which was of course the outcome of the 67 war, which it's called the 6-Day War, but it was actually over within minutes. They were defeated, but then it carried on because they wanted to conquer the Golan Heights, the Gaza and the West Bank. And that was hugely disputed. We should remember that in the UN, I mean, that's a lot of that comes from then. And the UN had the two sides when both opposed the occupation. Both said you have to stop the occupation. It's just a question of, should Israel be recognized, etc., by the Arab states or not. But both demanded that Israel stop the occupation. And in the context of that, to justify that, you can't possibly tell us to stop the occupation. Look at what we've suffered, and there shouldn't be the same. You shouldn't have the same sort of moral guidelines or moral measures when you talk about what we've gone through, what others have gone through. That's one reason, isn't it? Why the key reason why the uniqueness has been emphasized so much.
Yes, and also, for example, the fact that Hitler had meetings, or Hitler's, I think it's Ribbentrop, had meetings with the Mufti, and there was an attempt to associate any kind of Muslims in the area as somehow being part of the reason why the Holocaust took place at all. The Mufti objecting to people emigrating to Palestine was one of the reasons why the Nazis decided to set about the so-called final solution. So it's used as a rationalization for all sorts of cruel attacks on the Palestinian population, quite apart from anything else.
Yeah. I'm going to bring in Virginia now, who has problems with her camera, so she's just going to talk. Hi, Virginia.
Hi, I'm unmuted, I imagine. Yes.
You are.
Well, I'm sorry that I missed the first 15 minutes, and I haven't read Norman Finkelstein's book, and I don't really have a question, but just I would agree. I grew up in New York, was born in the mid-40s and grew up in New York in the 50s and 60s to a completely secular Jewish family. And I would certainly agree that the issue of Israel wasn't really in the forefront of a lot of people's minds. But I just wanted to say that I think that one thing that seemed to turn some people to Zionism was who had been communists, was the Khrushchev revelations of 1956. And I think that certainly, well, my father had a lot of sisters, and certainly two of them who that turned them to being terribly interested in Israel, whereas before they hadn't been. And I also don't know whether Ian mentioned, my first sort of knowledge of Norman Finkelstein was this dispute between him and Alan Dershowitz. Was this covered in your talk? I don't know, but which was absolutely vicious on Dershowitz's part and got Norman Finkelstein fired from the faculty of DePaul University. And another thing that happened in the States was when Black Power and SNCC was reaching a kind of crescendo. A lot of Jewish activists who had been very active in the civil rights movement and freedom and things, and a lot of that, kind of fell away. I'm not saying that those people became Zionists or anything like that, but the sort of and the dominance of the great predominance of Jews in that aspect of American left politics was not in the forefront so much anymore. And then, of course, there was the hijacking, the Leila Khaled hijacking. I'm just commenting that these are memories that I recall about shift in sort of interest in what was going on in Israel and among people that I knew or even didn't know very well in that period of time later on that hadn't been there before. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Virginia. Do you want to say anything on that, Ian?
I didn't go on at length about the Dershowitz debate with Norman Finkelstein because I didn't want to muddy the waters, as it were. But of course, it's an interesting illustration about how the academic world is dominated by an orthodoxy, and it's an orthodoxy related to, and you can see it today. I mean, people are losing their jobs now by having the temerity to suggest that Israel is engaged in genocide. The other thing I wanted to mention as well, of course, is that American Jews at the moment are actually in the forefront of Palestine solidarity. In a sense, it's rejuvenated a radicalism that existed in the Jewish population in the United States, and has been there for many, many decades. Very few Jews wanted to emigrate to Palestine. If you had any sense, you go to the United States. That's where they were. There are more Jews in New York than there are in Israel. So why the hell would you want to go to Israel? Why the hell would you want to go to Palestine? And they took with them that radicalism, which and the radicalism that you still see in people like Noam Chomsky or whoever else. And one argument about the whole kind of McCarthyite period was, of course, that it was also, as much as being anti-communist, it was ferociously anti-Semitic, not least of which because Jews were identified with being on the left. There's a PhD in it for somebody. If you look at the films that were produced in the 1960s and 70s, particularly kind of swords and sandals type dramas like The Robe and various other things, and Burt Lancaster, not Burt Lancaster, the other one will come to me in a minute. The film about Moses and all the rest of it, you actually see a whole kind of popular culture portrayal of valiant Israel up against the Philistines and all sorts of things, and it's redolent throughout popular culture in Hollywood. And by the way, of course, as you well know, you're much more likely to get thrown out the Labour Party if you're Jewish, especially if you're the wrong sort of Jew who objects to genocide being carried out in the name of Jewish people.
Charlton Heston, I think is.
Charlton Heston, that's the one. Yes.
Matthew, please.
Yes, Charlton Heston, otherwise named for his support of the National Rifle Association. Extremely right-wing man. But no, I think what you said is right and interesting. I think in terms of anti-Semitism, of course, the British government and so on, were almost equally anti-Semitic. The Churchill and so on were just monstrously anti-Semitic. And actually, of course, Zionism is, of course, allies itself, it tries to be a method of allying itself with that actual anti-Semitism. And of course, neither the British nor the Americans and so on were actually interested in rescuing anybody from the Holocaust. They knew about it. They didn't want to do anything about it. As is quite well outlined in Tony's own book, which is very good. I think what you're talking about. Also, I mean, you say, well, that you've got a situation where clearly the Israelis and the Zionists are, incredibly sensitive about any other genocides conducted against anybody else. which clearly, we could say, obviously there have been. Actually, I think, somebody made the point, I can't remember, that actually the direct progenitor of the methods of the Nazis was the German experience in what is now Namibia, in which they did try and exterminate an entire two peoples, I believe. And it's that actually that if you like, bringing that sort of colonial imperial experience to home, that's actually then used. And we're going to, we see this all the time, as that actually, of course, the methods used against the lesser people can then be applied to particularly, obviously, the working class at home. So, in those terms, it's actually to say, well, this is a methodology that comes out of capitalism itself, and not something peculiar to the Jews. So also in terms of, 1967 clearly is the turning point, because obviously you get a situation where you have, previous to that, as you say, there isn't particular support. Actually, the first lot of people to support Israel were the Stalinists. The USSR recognized Israel within 3 days of its creation, well before anybody else. And not only that, of course, they were the first to supply weapons. They supplied weapons to Haganah in order to allow it to set up the state of Israel. So the Stalinists, again, another thing you can put down to the crimes of Stalin against, the left and the peoples of the world. So in those terms, and of course this of course is the same in terms of, you look at the Labour Party. The point that's been made by numbers of people, of course, is that historically, of course, it was the left of the Labour, or technically the left. What you would describe as the left of the Labour Party, who supported the Zionists up until about 1980. People like Tony Benn and so forth who supported the Zionists. And of course, once you get the growth, and the thing I think this is critical of what's happening at the moment, of course, is that you've had, from that point onwards, from the 70s and 80s onwards, the growth of a Palestinian solidarity campaign, which has been continuous. And it's actually that, you've got an existing what's happening what's happening now is taking place in the context of, you've got an existing solidarity campaign which has been around for decades, and people have actually understand something of the issue. And thus you see much bigger response than say, some other equivalent wars, and a much clearer set of communications. If you look at sort of the massacres in the invasion of Iraq and so on, and Afghanistan, very, very little established communication between those, the peoples of those countries and say, the imperialist countries, whereas in the case of Palestinians, it's been going on for decades. And so therefore, this is why I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing this explosion of solidarity, and why it's so embarrassing to the imperialists themselves, and actually points up the very sort of naked state of the imperialists. But the thing about 67, of course, is the success in the war, is enormous. The Israelis not only, take over Gaza, the West Bank, Golan Heights, all of Sinai. They wind up with the effective de facto border being the Suez Canal. It's huge. And therefore, obviously then you have a position in which the Americans say, well, okay, well, they're our guys, we'll support them. Because obviously they're good at this, killing people, and therefore they can form this basis of control of the Middle East, which has always been a problem for them. And therefore you get, obviously, as people have also pointed out, Biden for the last 40 odd years or longer, because obviously he's been around in politics in bourgeois politics for a very long time, since the middle 70s. Saying, well, we can't replace Israel. It's something we absolutely need in order to control this place. And paying them billions every year and giving them loads of weapons is cheap, because they actually form this basis of control. And that's what we're seeing at the moment, because is that starting to peel apart. the fact that the project is itself falling down. Now, I mean, the other thing, of course, is that actually, I mean, while, as you say, that what we're seeing is obviously a campaign in the US in particular, which is led by young Jewish activists in support of the Palestinians, which is brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and very difficult for these guys to say, oh, you know, I mean, they try it, and this is it. This is great sort of found stuff, you know, you're anti-Semites, whereas actually, of course, they're actually Jewish. I mean, you get, I mean, the ridiculous nature of the hearing in the House of Congress on the 5th of December, in which led by Elise Stefanik, who is an actual anti-Semite, who believes in the Great Replacement theory. You know, she's an actual card-carrying anti-Semite, accusing people of being anti-Semitic for opposing the genocide of Palestinians. It's unbelievable. But there is then also another faction, of course, is that you see that there is, I mean, much of the actual settlement on the West Bank actually is led by Americans, people with American passports. So there is that faction in there as well. And then it's that actually the driver, that's actually the driver of the current government, of course, is they're in charge. Those guys are in charge. You know, they're maniacs, of course. So in that sense, it's actually pulling the whole thing apart. So yeah, I mean, I think it's you know what you're saying in terms of the Holocaust. It's important, but it's, you know, it's actually to try and go beyond that in terms of the development, particularly obviously the system of imperialism, which we're seeing the guts of it being peeled out, which has been really, it's going to be an interesting time.
Thanks, Matthew. Do you want to say anything to that, Ian?
Just to reiterate that some of the most disgusting anti-Semites are actually Zionists. One only has to mention Major General Ord Wingate, for example. I mean, the Irgun and the Haganah, and indeed the Stern Gang, the Lehi, really learned their trade in terms of driving out villagers and destroying them, thanks to the British. The uprising of Arabs who were being displaced. I mean, it has to be remembered that people were being displaced for a long time before 1947, and the uprising that took place in 1936 against the British support for the Zionist project, and it was an uprising against British rule. Most Arabs were living pretty comfortably with Jewish neighbours, but it was the Arab uprising against British rule, and of course then subsequently people who were trained by the British formed the Haganah, and particularly under the leadership of Ord Wingate, and that was subsequently, you know, the main force that was driving Palestinians from their homes, and of course. The Jewish labor movement was originally called Poale Zion. It was an affiliate of the Israeli Labour Party, and it was at a time when, you know, I don't want to go into it, but if you mention black sections or anything like that in the 1980s, you'd be howled down. But Poale Zion had always affiliated to the Labour Party, and it exerted an enormous influence, especially on what laughingly passed for the left. Yeah, just that.
I'm just going to ask you both, maybe either of you knows it. You mentioned Stalin supporting Israel, and Ian, you outlined earlier, you thought it might have something to do, you might have thought that they would turn anti-imperialist or would turn against the West, etc. How did the Soviet Union, though, view the Nakba? Did they say anything on it? Did they criticize it, to your knowledge?
I don't recall anything. I mean, what we see is actually the Israeli Communist Party helped to organize the shipment of weapons into Palestine, and so Czechoslovakia, during the Nakba, was effectively supplying the weapons for the Haganah, and without that, it's arguable that they couldn't have accomplished it. I think there was without making a fuller study of it, I'm speculating, but the idea that there was a kind of left Zionism may have may have given some kind of reason to believe that somehow it could be turned into an anti-imperialist colony, as it were. But it must have been completely fatuous, because most of the left Zionists were not left at all. I mean, Ben-Gurion was supposed to be a left Zionist, but I mean, he was in charge of the Haganah and directly responsible for the deaths of many tens of thousands.
There's also Stalin himself, of course, was an anti-Semite, as we know, and always there's been this collaboration between the anti-Semites and the Zionists.
When I lived in Moscow, I remember having conversations with people who said, "I'm not anti-Zionist. I'm anti-Jewish. I think they should all go and live in Israel." And of course,
exactly.
there was that whole period, and I remember it very much in the 1980s in student union type politics, where the refuseniks in the Soviet Union were treated as absolute darlings, because Israel wanted a good steady supply of very right-wing people who'd come out of the Soviet Union and hated anything to do with socialism. The
part of the far right in Israel actually is exactly that, ex-Russian.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks both. Robert, please.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I just want to go back to a point I think Comrade McFadden made in the U.S. and after the post-67 war, as Ian pointed out, and Finkelstein stresses, that is really the beginning of, it's a historical beginning of really a full-throated identification of the U.S. interests and the interests of U.S. Jews, supposedly, with the state of Israel. And as Comrade McFadden pointed out, there was a weaponization, the weaponization of anti-Semitization. Weaponizing anti-Semitism was first directed against the Black movement at that time, as it began, SNCC, etc., began to identify with other movements of oppressed people, specifically the Palestinians, and against the left in general. And I remember it was around 1971 that Rabbi Meir Kahane, whom people may recognize as the founder of the Koch Party later, a fascist party in Israel, a terrorist party. And the JDL, I remember specifically attacking protests against, say, Golda Meir, visiting at Brandeis in late 1971. They were armed with chains and karate weapons. And the point being, though, that suddenly, in this United Front that I was in, about 100 leftists was probably 50% Jews. Jewish leftists tended to be very almost dominant in the left at that time, and that suddenly we were called anti-Semites, if not Nazis. And the most celebrated case that I'll just kind of end up with was what the attacks on writers, particularly James Baldwin, in I think the 1980s at the University of Massachusetts, when he was severely attacked for his support to the Palestinians, his anti-Zionism. And he was someone that used to be routinely featured on US mainstream talk shows on television before this period. Suddenly he gets disappeared in the 80s. Baldwin was one. Gore Vidal later, in the later 80s, in the pages of Nation magazine, is attacked by the neocons, Norman Podhoretz, etc. So the things that are going on today, the anti-Semitization that you're facing, I know in particularly nasty form in the UK, it resonates with me. I mean, very, very personally. I'm someone that has, as a kid, but in a Jewish neighborhood, I supposedly have a tree in Israel. So it was as Ian has said, it was left wing in the post-war period up till probably 67, it's left wing to be even talking about this stuff. Then we get Exodus and Moses and all that, that whole genre that was talked about. So I just wanted to, just to add to Kahana, I think I mentioned that he emigrates to Israel, yes, and founds the Koch Party, which is extremely, a biblical return to the biblical Judea and Samaria at its Israel. And but my main point there is not just the exploitation of Jewish suffering, which Finkelstein highlights, but the instrumentalization of it against certain spaces or areas, particularly the Black movement and the left. That at that time, particularly, well, I remember suddenly we were we were sponsoring speakers that were from the Israeli Socialist Organization, and they were being attacked in these forums with this craziness that Israel is the Viet Cong of the Mideast, and Peter Buch was one, and that you people are you're feeding anti-Semitism. So I just wanted to maybe leave it at that.
Thanks, Robert. No, it's also interesting because we had a lot. Obviously, had the Corbyn movement was taken down mainly by anti-Semitism, and a lot of people around the labor movement thought, well, this was just, they're just doing it to get rid of Corbyn, which they also did to get rid of Corbyn. But of course, it much precedes this. The weaponization of anti-Semitism has been used many, many times before. It was a useful tool against Corbyn. But of course, it is mainly about stopping criticism of Israel and, stopping anybody in their tracks by saying you're an anti-Semite. Nothing should be taken seriously that you're saying. It's a very blunt tool, but it's been used since 1967, and increasingly so. It comes back and back. Thank you, Robert. Did you want to say anything on that, Ian?
Just a couple of little things about the whole question around freedom of speech. I remember very, as clear as day, when there was a time when in National Union of Student Politics, for example, no platform for racists and fascists was all the rage, and lots of student unions, including my own, said we took a platform of no platform for racists and fascists. And then I watched effectively what was then Sunderland Polytechnic Students' Union disaffiliated its Jewish society on the grounds that they were racist because they were Zionists. And what then followed was a kind of series of heated debates. And from that moment onwards, I've never been able to tolerate the idea of no platform. I think it's far better to have that debate, because we've seen the way in which it's been used against the left. You're anti-Israel, so therefore you're anti-Semitic, so you may not speak at all. We'll cancel your, we'll cancel your booking and this kind of thing. And from that moment onwards, I was never able to tolerate it. I remember a rabbi getting up, and one who struck me most of all, the rabbi getting up and saying, Israel, Judaism has got as much to do with Zionism as apartheid has to do with the United Dutch Reformed Church. It's a right-wing political, Zionism is a right-wing nationalist movement. It's got nothing to do with Judaism, and so that was important. One other tiny little footnote, of course, the McCarthyite period meant that Britain gained lots of really good left-wing writers. Just an aside, writers and actors and all sorts who couldn't get employed in the United States came to Britain.
John, please.
Thanks, Tina. Two quick points. The first is that when I first came into anti-fascist politics, when I moved to Manchester in 1974, there were a lot of quite elderly by then, or late middle-aged Jewish comrades who had been in Ajax after the Second World War, and they had fought in the streets of North Manchester in Cheetham Hill against Mosleyites who were still around then. And of course, we know about Cable Street before the war, and there were similar confrontations in Manchester and Leeds and various other cities. And that has ebbed away. That generation died off in the 70s and the 80s. And when I look at demonstrations, Palestinian demonstrations now, and look at the Jewish Voice for Labour contingent, who are very visible, they're either my age or older than me. And in the meantime, the Jewish left, which used to be so strong in the diaspora generally, and certainly in this country, has disappeared. And that has created, I believe, the political space for Zionism to move forward onto the offensive without knowing that they will be opposed by large sections of the Jewish community. That they do not have that fear anymore. And that allowed the Zionism and the Holocaust industry to move forward. They got this international human rights definition through, and they really made the most of it. I mean, the very little that I know about where that definition came from is that there were a lot of Zionist academics who got together about 10 years ago and started basically campaigning for it, and it went through. And it's that definition which has enabled the weaponization of anti-Semitism in a way that I think, although I accept that what people are saying that it had been around for some time, I think that it's actually moved through the gears because of that international human rights definition, and is now able to score political victories of all sorts of types, including keeping the South Africa's hearing at The Hague today to 4th place in the BBC Evening News tonight. It came behind Fashion Week, for instance, which tells you, you know, that I think that the situation has changed, and it's changed because of the absence of a large multi-generational Jewish left, which is partly the problem of the British left, and partly the problem of a generation dying off and not being properly replaced. And that's partly to do with gentrification as well. But the important point I'm trying to make through all of this is that the weaponization of anti-Semitism has never known such an open field as it's got now. And it's able to score major victories and have major influence over political parties and major mainstream media outlets as well.
Thank you, John. And major victims. I mean, Norman Finkelstein is one of the victims. People are losing their jobs, etc. Yeah. For sure. Tony, you wanted to come back in again, so let's have that, and then I'll bring you back in, Ian.
All right. Yes. Hello. I'm sorry I missed some of the discussion, but I am back. Oh God, hold on. Someone is ringing me, but I will. Let me just turn it off for the moment. I was quite interested in the reception for the Holocaust industry, because when it came out, sorry, I'm just telling the person who rang me. When it came out, of course, it met with a storm of protest. And I think Jonathan Friedland's The Guardian Zionist Gatekeeper summed it up, the feeling best, when he wrote that the Holocaust industry was closer to the people, and Finkelstein himself was closer to the people who created the Holocaust than to those who suffered it. But it wasn't just Finkelstein. The SWP, of course, were also not very happy, because for the SWP, anti-Semitism is an eternal and unchanging phenomenon. I mean, they really do consider it to be something which is as ever present as it was in the 30s in many ways in Britain. And I just quote from, it was a review article by their chief theoretician, Finkelstein and the Holocaust, which is, you can find it quite easily on the internet. Kalinikov said, Finkelstein has come under vicious attack. Jonathan Friedland wrote in The Guardian what I've just quoted. But then he goes on to say, so exaggerated is Finkelstein's polemic, that at times he comes, quite contrary to his own intentions, dangerously close to giving comfort to those who dream of new Holocausts. And he says, how different is his assertion that the field of Holocaust studies is replete with nonsense, if not plain fraud, from the Holocaust revisionist David Irving's rantings during his recent libel case. So the SWP, which of course has extremely simplistic politics on most things, is unable to see, for instance, how the history of the Holocaust has been fashioned in a particular manner. For example, I mean, I've written about it, it's in my book. Some of the major Jewish Holocaust heroes, like Marek Edelman, who led the Warsaw Ghetto resistance, or Rudolf Werber, who was the first of the Jewish escapees from Auschwitz, who escaped to warn Hungarian Jewry of what lay in store for them, and whose report, the Werber-Wetzler report, or the Auschwitz Protocols, as it's better known, was suppressed by Rudolf Kastner, the leader of Hungarian Zionism and the representative in Hungary of the Jewish Agency. None of this percolates through to the SWP. They don't understand, you know, how literally people have been erased from the memory. I mean, and yet Zionist historians themselves have covered these topics. I mean, I quote extensively from a 2-volume book by Shabtai Betzavi, who's a right-wing Zionist, and he went through how the memoirs and the writings of the Zionist Holocaust heroes who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto have been changed almost out of recognition. People like Haj Klinger, for example, whose memoirs, diary, was almost unrecognizable. But he went through one after the other to show how they've been tampered with in order to fit into the Zionist narrative, which in essence is that the Zionists led the Jewish resistance to the Nazis, whereas the truth, of course, is that 2/3 of the Judenrat, the Jewish councils, were collaborators. And Hannah Arendt wrote about this in Eichmann in Jerusalem. It was the first major book. I mean, it sold, I mean, it's hundreds of thousands, but the Zionists were aghast that when she wrote about the Eichmann trial, she wrote about all the things that they had wanted her not to mention. And there were a number. For example, the name of Konrad Adenauer, the German chancellor, was not allowed to be mentioned in the trial because of the relationship with Germany. The fact that Adenauer had as his closest advisor Hans Globke, who was instrumental in the writing of the Nuremberg laws, and who as a jurist gave the severest possible interpretation to the Nuremberg laws. For instance, not only was sexual relations with an Aryan forbidden, a capital offense in Germany itself, but he also interpreted the law as applying on an extraterritorial basis. That is, a Jew who had such relations with an Aryan outside of Germany would still be guilty of the offence if they were located inside Germany. So the SWP, for the SWP, any attempt to look at these things is anathema, because they have a very simplistic analysis. They don't really see how anti-Semitism has been weaponized and fashioned in a weapon for those who defend what Israel is doing. I did actually raise at our Trades Council last night as to whether Stand Up to Racism would be marching with Zionists in Glasgow this year as well. And I got the impression that I think they finally got the message, but we shall wait and see. But clearly it would be an outrage if they did. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Want to reply to any of this, Ian?
Just to add, these US origins of miscegenation laws.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So the Nazis didn't invent them. They took them lock, stock, and barrel. And of course, Henry Ford's support for Nazism. He had a very nice medal with a very nice swastika on it for helping to establish motor plants in Nazi Germany.
Well, Jews, the American Jews, including the Jewish establishment, launched a boycott of Henry Ford and his cause, and he was forced to close down, I think it's called the Dearborn Independent, which had been printing the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and various other anti-Semitic nonsense. Boycotts were all in fashion when it suited them, but of course today, anyone who mentions the word boycott is by definition anti-Semitic. But there you go. That's how Zionism has fashioned the narrative and the discourse. And it's really up to us to challenge that narrative, really, because it's a very poisonous narrative, and it's a narrative that has consequences as well in terms of human beings and their lives. It's not without cost.
Thank you, Tony. The last person who's got a hand up is Anthony, and then bring back Ian to sum up the session.
I think I'll start what was his name, Matthew said, that you have to see the crimes of Zionism and then the Holocaust and fascism. It's coming out of the deep crisis of capitalism, which is in its worst crisis today. I mean, the slave trade was bad in its early days of capitalism, but as Mandel said, in the decaying degeneration of capitalism, all the worst features come out and rot, and it's coming out again. And fascism is a major problem. I mean, the thing that's undermining the wildest and the fascists over there is the pro-Palestinian movement. But we have. I think the Holocaust is used for pillars purposes for the Zionists, but also it's important that not just against the Jews, but against Jewish working in middle class, the gays, and all the other oppression works. So bring back that memory, which I think is important to do. There's also a split in the ruling class, and the American elections and the British elections are going to be fought on fascism versus bourgeois democracy. I wouldn't vote Democrat or bourgeois party in America, but Labour could go on that big theme. And they might go slightly more social democratic, and they could be the biggest landslide ever. I mean, they're talking about the Tories being down to 100, Reform UK are dangerous. There's a thing on politics, there's a left shift as well. They're overplaying the fascists. On Politics Live, some of the dangers of the fascists. It's one thing. I have two other points, and I'll come out. It's one thing to adapt to the Zionists and the United Front, but this anti-fascist wave, we have to unite with all kinds of people, but we don't compromise our politics and policy, and that would be extreme opportunism. But we can't be ultra left after. And the single issue, Zionism, Palestine, and the anti-fascist work linked, but there have to be separate alliances and separate united fronts on that. But I was interested in what Robert Montgomery was saying. I don't know if it's known over here, but Trap Barnes has committed absolute hara-kiri. It's one like the Trap, and I supported the Vietnam War. Is opposed to a ceasefire in the American militant. I wonder if he knows. My father went to the American SWP convention, Paparoni, in 1957. He knew Peter Buck, and they're having the whole debate when they were Trotsky's saying what Plato, and they had the whole debate all night in these flats. I think that's the early 60s. I wonder if he was from the Robert Montgomery was from the American Socialist Workers' Party tradition, knowing Peter Buck, because they played a big role against Zionism. But now Trump wings took over the group, probably doing entry to destroy the organization. I don't think they'll be viable in 2 or 3 months. I wonder if some of the old Trotskyists are coming back, because they're aging and dying, so when we come back. The good youth radicalization is giving a new lease on life to people. But we need the old cadre for the continuity and their experiences to have, because they're very knowledgeable and experienced people. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, comrade. Ian, would you like to reply to anything and perhaps sum up this session then? Thank you.
The first thing is just to simply say, don't waste your time with the BBC, watch Al Jazeera, which is giving by far and away the best coverage of what's going on in terms of not only what's happening in Gaza, but in terms of the actions of the South African government in the Court of Human Rights. The other thing is about fascism, and of course this crops up time and time again. I take fascism to mean what happened in the 1930s, not because it was just then. It's just that the importance of that concatenation of events where you had the potential for a proletariat that could take power and a bourgeoisie that was prepared to support any bunch of thugs that would prevent that possibility. And that from that point of view, just simply saying that something is right-wing, nationalist and authoritarian and therefore it's fascist, I think is a bit of a mistake. Yes, it's right-wing, yes, it's nationalist, yes, it's brutal, Zionism, but that doesn't make it fascism of itself. You know, and I think it's important to draw that distinction. It's not just an epithet, it has consequences to chuck this stuff about. But you know, it's very hard to argue that there is a more odious government in the world than Israel at the moment, and our first action is to oppose it here, whether it's a direct action as Palestine Action has done, or through the Palestine Solidarity movement generally. But our actions have to be against also the British government. The likelihood is that the Tories will lose the next election and there will be a Labour government. No one's actually going to be voting Labour because of they're massively impressed with Keir Starmer, and Keir Starmer will have to go into an election saying why he thought that the genocide being perpetrated against the people of Gaza was something that he thought was a legitimate expression of international law. So the importance here is we need the enemy is at home, and we need to fight those, and by all means necessary. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Tony wants to come back in, so I'll break our usual routine and bring him back in.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on what Ian said about the Israeli regime not being a fascist regime. I mean, I agree with him. Although there are self-declared fascists within that coalition, without a doubt, Miri Regev, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, and others as well. But I agree, it isn't. Fascism is a different political animal, although it often has much in common with what is a settler colonial state. I mean, that's not to say, therefore, that Israel is better. Indeed, I mean, you could argue that settler colonial regimes are one stage worse than fascism. America never experienced a fascist regime, but they exterminated the bulk of the Indian population. The same in Australia. The same in the Belgian Congo. So, I mean, settler colonialism is not better, but the difference, of course, is in settler colonialism, the settlers formed their own society in which there's a class alliance between the working class and the ruling class at the expense of the indigenous population, whereas fascism is predicated on the destruction of the organizations of the working class. That is not the case in Israel. No one has suggested that the Histadrut be wiped out. On the contrary, it's part of the criminal conspiracy against the Palestinians. So it's important. I mean, people do call Israel fascist, more as a term of abuse rather than as a term of analysis and understanding. So that's all.
It's a very important clarification, because if we don't have that weapon of fascism, understanding what it actually is, we won't recognize when it comes back and when it does try to destroy the working class. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Ian. Brilliant presentation. Very good discussion as well from the floor. Thank you very much. We're going to see Tony again next week. Also, Comrade Tom Suarez will be talking about Zionism during and after the Holocaust in Israel. And that'll be a very interesting discussion, no doubt. Thank you, comrades, and hope to see many of you on Saturday at the demonstration in London, or wherever you are out there. We'll be demonstrating against what's going on. Thank you very much, comrades.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.